If you've ever walked into a holiday as the designated single, you know it's a role, not a status. I thought I could survive Christmas in Maple Ridge the way you survive a staff meeting. Smile, take notes, leave early. I was 29, a community college counselor in Columbus, good at decoding what people mean when they don't want to say it. Families are in formal theaters, and December is peak season. There's the impresario cousin who wants a production, the matriarch who wants a headline, the uncle who treats silence like a question he hasn't answered yet. You've seen them. You probably played one of them without noticing. Tessa, my cousin, lived to direct the room. She ran a boutique PR shop in Cincinnati and believed life only worked if you gave it a log line. Holiday gatherings reward archetypes because they simplify anxiety. The settled sibling is proof the system works. The wanderer keeps everyone entertained. The single cousin is a mirror the group tilts toward its own expectations. If you're that person, you feel every glance as a suggested rewrite. You start answering questions before they're asked. Work is good. Yes, dating in Columbus is interesting. No, I don't hate children. You trim the truth because the room prefers tight pacing. I told myself that analysis wasn't bitterness. It was strategy. This year had stakes beyond small talk. Our college was courting a county workforce grant, and my Uncle Pete, who sat on the advisory board, would be there. Any hint that I was unserious could ripple where I needed steadiness. Tessa texted on my drive. Trust me. Let's make this year easy. You know the line. It never means easy. It means she's already storyboarding you. When I walked in, the house smelled like cinnamon and ambition. Tessa met me with a hug you could hear. Her hair had that urgent wave people get when they believe in their own momentum. You look great, she said, which was less compliment than cue. In family theater, compliments are props. They signal entrance, motive, turn. She guided me toward the living room, like a stage manager hitting marks. And there he was by the mantel, holding a mug with deliberate casualness, the way people do when they've rehearsed casual. This is Evan, Tessa said, bright and neutral. He had the friendly, non-threatening face agencies cast when they want everyone to nod. He shook my hand and leaned in just enough to avoid microphones that didn't exist. Thank you for going along, he murmured, like someone confirming a booking. The room kept moving around us, wrapping paper, sports talk, a timer beeping in the kitchen. I smiled, not because I agreed, but because the scene had obviously started and the audience was already watching. There's a type of person families accept instantly, the pleasant placeholder who lowers everyone's blood pressure. He doesn't disrupt alliances or invite comparison. He radiates. Safe. Casting directors call it comfort. Families call it. Finally, if you stood in that spotlight, you know the cues. Steady eye contact, light humor, just enough personal detail to seem rooted. Evan wore the role like an iron shirt. My aunt refilled his cocoa before she knew why. I tugged Tessa into the hallway by the coat rack where the good scarves live. In every clan, there's a producer who confuses care with control. She was that archetype in heels. Her defense arrived fully briefed. You hate the questions, she said. Pete is on the grant board. Optics matter. This helps you. PR logic always sounds like kindness translated into slogans. If you're nodding, that's because you've rationalized a little theater too. We tell ourselves stories to reduce friction, then insist their reality's better draft. Back in the living room, Evan moved like someone trained to be background and focal point at once. He leaned over and kept his voice easy. He did medical school simulations, he said, playing standardized patients for third years who needed to learn how to ask without leading. Holiday boyfriend gigs were just a different rubric. He'd read my public LinkedIn, skimmed the college website, and built a file. We met at a coffee shop near campus, for months in, taking it slow. Noticed the beats, believable, non-specific, future-proof. Archetypes sell because they're portable. I set boundaries the way I coach students before an appeals board. Short, clear, repeatable. No big declarations. No kissing. If anyone probes, we pivot to the grant. He nodded like a good scene partner, relieved by a script. That's a truth you learn in counseling. When interruption isn't possible, modification is mercy. You can't stop a production, but you can rewrite your lines. If you've ever managed a group project at Thanksgiving, you already know that. Uncle P drifted over carrying a paper plate balanced with ham and confidence. He fit the benevolent gatekeeper mold, affectionate, status-aware, chronically advisory. "Heard good things about your outreach," he said, and then noticed Evan. I felt the room's attention tilt like a microphone. "This is Evan," I said, giving him the soft launch. Evan offered a warm hello and a handshake that was designed to reassure donors. Pete's smile tightened into evaluation. "So," he said, "you finally found someone who can keep up." The line was friendly, but the subtext was a ledger opening. Families measure newcomers against expectations, not reality. Pete studied Evan like a candidate resume. Firm handshake, eye contact, background check pending. If you've been in that chair, you know every question is coded. "What do you do?" is less curiosity, more math. Can this person justify their presence? Evan answered smoothly, naming a medical program in a tone that suggested prestige but not arrogance. It landed. Pete's nod carried the weight of an unofficial stamp. Archetypes are shortcuts, and Evan was hitting all the beats. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I caught myself cataloging the scene like case notes. When someone fits too neatly, the mind starts scanning for loose threads. My aunt chimed in with small talk about holiday travel, and Evan delivered a practiced anecdote about delayed flights. Harmless, perfectly timed. The family laughed, relaxed, and shifted focus back to food. That's when I realized he wasn't performing for me. He was performing for them, which in a way made him better at the job than I could ever be. But here's the problem. Once a script works, people expect sequels. Families love to cast you in a stable role because it reduces their own uncertainty. The counselor cousin with a promising boyfriend was safer than single counselor navigating professional politics. The grand conversation I wanted with Pete was already being reshaped into a subplot about my future. You've seen it happen. Someone's career update gets rerouted into a wedding joke, a child announcement, or a mortgage suggestion. Archetypes devour nuance. I tried to steer things back. "We're rolling out new mentorship initiatives this semester," I told Pete, hoping to open the door to the grant. He nodded politely, but his gaze returned to Evan. "Sounds like you two are building a foundation," he said. "That's how gatekeepers talk when they've already decided your headline. If you've ever fought to keep the focus on your work while people orbit around your relationship status, you know the futility." Tessa floated by, carrying wine glasses like trophies. She gave me a look that said, "See? Easy." Easy wasn't the word. Smooth was accurate. Deceptive, too. Because smoothness in families doesn't settle tension. It buries it, waiting for the next act. And as I watched Evan charm my uncle without breaking a sweat, I realized I wasn't just an audience member. I was a participant in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Dinner stretched like a long negotiation. Plates moved, conversations overlapped, and every glance toward Evan became a subtle referendum. My cousin Leah whispered across the table, "Where did you two meet?" She meant it casually, but that's never really casual. Origins define legitimacy. Evan slid in with our prearranged coffee shop story, adding a sprinkle about spilling his drink and me laughing it off. It was the kind of anecdote families adore, mildly embarrassing, easy to picture, wrapped in charm. They ate it up along with the stuffing. I noticed the shift almost instantly. People who normally cornered me with questions about dating apps or timelines now redirected their curiosity into playful ribbing. "He seems like a keeper. Don't let him get away." Familiar lines, but now they carried approval instead of critique. Archetypal substitution at work. The single cousin role had been rewritten into up-and-coming couple. And with that, my stock value in the family market rose without me doing a thing. If you've ever watched someone's opinion of you change just because of who's standing beside you, you understand how flimsy perception can be. Still, something about the smoothness grated. It wasn't Evan's fault. He was doing exactly what he was hired to do. But watching my family warm to him so quickly exposed how conditional their acceptance felt. It wasn't about me, my work, or my goals. It was about fitting into a frame they preferred. Families, like institutions, often reward the symbol over the substance. You don't need to actually achieve stability. You just need to look like you have. Pete eventually brought the conversation back to business, asking about workforce readiness and local partnerships. I leaned in, eager to finally talk shop. But even here, Evan's presence distorted the exchange. Pete framed his advice in, "you too," terms, as if my professional ambitions were suddenly a joint project. "You'll want stability at home if you're taking on those grants," he said, nodding toward Evan like he was an extension of my resume. It was bizarre, and a little insulting, yet no one else seemed to notice. By the time dessert landed, I was tired of smiling through a performance I hadn't agreed to. Archetypes simplify, but they also erase. And as the family laughed at another of Evan's perfectly pitched jokes, I wondered how long I could keep playing along before the erasure became permanent. Later, when the kitchen had thinned out and the dishwasher hummed like background applause, I cornered Tessa near the sink. "You didn't warn me about the full script," I said. She shrugged like a director defending the cut. "It's working, isn't it? Nobody's hounding you." Pete's impressed. "You should be thanking me." "That's the logic of producers. If the audience claps, the actors must be grateful. But if you've ever been cast in a role you didn't choose, you know applause can feel more like handcuffs." Evan appeared then, drying his hands on a towel he clearly didn't own. "You okay?" he asked quietly. There was something disarming in his tone. Professional concern, maybe, but gentler than I expected. He was good at this because he knew the job wasn't just performance. It was containment. He wasn't here to win me over. He was here to shield me from scrutiny. That realization softened my irritation, though it didn't erase it. Families operate like ecosystems. Remove one pressure, and another emerges. My Aunt Carol, emboldened by wine, cornered me about plans. She used the word in italics, the way relatives do when they're really asking about marriage and kids. Evan responded before I could. "We're taking things slow, but it feels right." He delivered it smoothly, warm but vague, the exact tone that halts further questions. It worked. Carol smiled, satisfied, and floated away. That's when it struck me. He was editing my life in real time, trimming away the parts that usually made me defensive. The more he did it, the more I saw how easily my family accepted the edited version. They didn't want nuance, only reassurance. Evan's presence gave them a headline they preferred, and once they had it, they stopped digging. If you've ever realized that peace in a group comes not from truth, but from an acceptable story, you know how unsettling that is. When we finally stepped outside for some air, snow flurries drifting under the porch light, I asked Evan why he took jobs like this. He shrugged. "People want roles filled. Doesn't matter if it's medicine or holidays. I just fit the outline." It was matter of fact, not bitter. I envied his detachment. For me, this wasn't a gig. It was my identity on the line. And for the first time all night, I wondered whether I'd actually lost control of it. The next morning I woke up in the guest room, the kind with floral sheets that smell faintly of detergent no matter how many times they're washed. Family houses carry layers of history like sediment. You return to them not as you are now, but as the sum of every version they remember. That's why these gatherings feel heavier than the square footage suggests. You walk in an adult. You're treated like a composite sketch of every age you've ever been. Over breakfast, I watched Evan pour coffee as if he belonged there. My uncle slid him the sports section. My aunt asked whether he wanted oatmeal or eggs. It startled me how quickly he'd been absorbed. Archetypes work fast once they're recognized. The reliable partner role gave the family permission to treat me like a complete narrative instead of an unfinished draft. You've probably seen this too. One external signal can erase years of doubt in a group's eyes. But here's the trap. Once they believe the role, they start building on it. Leah leaned across the table and asked if we considered a trip together in the spring. "Couples trips really test compatibility," she said, clearly expecting a playful response. Evan didn't miss a beat. "We've talked about it. Maybe the Smoky Mountains." He smiled at me like a stage cue. My family nodded approvingly, filing it away as fact. That's when I felt the weight of it. Fiction was being archived as memory. I excused myself under the pretense of checking email. In truth, I needed air. Out on the porch, I thought about the grant. My career depended on credibility, not theatrics. If Pete's support was tethered to this image of stability, what happened when the image dissolved? That's the risk of leaning on archetypes. They give you leverage in the moment, but they demand consistency you can't always deliver. Evan joined me outside a few minutes later. He didn't try to charm. He just sipped his coffee, quiet, letting the cold do the talking. Finally he said, "You don't have to like it, just decide if it helps you." It was blunt, professional, but not unkind. And it left me with a question I couldn't shake. Was I using him? Or was he using me to prove how replaceable roles really are? By afternoon, the house buzzed again, with cousins arriving from out of town. Every entrance carried hugs, coats piled on chairs, voices rising to fill the space. I watched my family fold Evan into the flow like he'd always been part of it. That's the thing about groups. They don't just accept a role, they reinforce it. My uncle teased him about joining the family poker night. My grandmother slipped him an extra slice of pie. He accepted each gesture with polite ease, which only deepened their comfort. For me, the shift was stranger. Normally, I'd be peppered with questions about work, travel, or why I wasn't settling down. This year those questions evaporated, replaced with knowing smiles. Silence where there used to be scrutiny felt like relief, but also erasure. It wasn't that they valued me more now, it was that they valued the illusion more. If you've ever been praised for something that isn't actually true, you know the hollowness that follows. Still, I couldn't deny the utility. When Pete and I finally found a quiet moment by the fireplace, he opened with encouragement. "You've got stability now," he said, glancing toward Evan. "And that matters when you're managing big initiatives." Then he offered practical guidance on the grant, concrete advice I'd been chasing for months. I nodded along, grateful but uneasy. His support was real, but I knew it was built on scaffolding that wasn't. Meanwhile, Tessa floated nearby like a producer monitoring her pilot episode. She caught my eye with a look that said, "See what I delivered?" In her mind, this was proof of concept. But here's what archetypes conceal. Once a role works too well, people expect a sequel. Families, like audiences, want continuity, which meant I'd now have to manage not just my career, but a phantom relationship. Later, as we cleaned up wrapping paper and dishes, Evan leaned toward me and whispered, "They really like me. That helps you, right?" It was simple, matter of fact, and he was right, it did help. But standing there with a trash bag in my hand, I realized help can also be a trap, because once you accept it, you owe the story more than you intended. That night, after the cousins drifted home and the dishwasher rattled through another cycle, I sat in the den scrolling through emails from work. Evan dropped onto the opposite couch with the relaxed posture of someone who knew his shift was nearly over. "You'll get your grant," he said, almost offhand. It startled me, like he'd read the subtext better than anyone else here. Maybe he had. Actors are trained to scan a room for what isn't spoken. I asked him why he was so good at this, why he could step into a family and be instantly accepted. He shrugged. "People want patterns. I give them one they recognize. Once they see it, they stop questioning." It was unsettling because it was true. Archetypes save energy. They let people move past uncertainty, but they also flatten the individual behind them. If you've ever been mistaken for a version of yourself that you don't actually live, you know the quiet frustration that brings. The next morning, during gift exchanges, the pattern repeated. My aunt handed me a cookbook. "For you too." My grandmother tucked a card into Evan's hand with the same care she gave her actual grandkids. Each gesture blurred the line further. What began as a holiday buffer had hardened into a narrative artifact. These weren't just performances anymore. They were memories being built on false ground. Pete pulled me aside before lunch. "Proud of you," he said, clapping my shoulder. "It's good to see you with someone steady. Makes me more confident about backing your project." The grant advice he offered was detailed and actionable, exactly what I needed. And yet, I couldn't shake the knowledge that his faith in my professional future now rested partly on Evan's borrowed presence. Archetypes had done their job too well, and I was the beneficiary of a fiction. When Evan and I finally escaped for a walk in the cold, he looked at me with something like sympathy. "This doesn't last," he said. "They'll adjust back once I'm gone. You just have to decide if you want the short-term gain." He meant it kindly, but it cut sharper than he realized. Because the truth was, I didn't know if I could separate the gain from the lie anymore. By the final day, I felt like I was living in two scripts at once. On the surface, I was the cousin who had finally settled, the one who brought a steady, likable boyfriend home. Beneath that, I was still the counselor chasing credibility, worried my career momentum had been tethered to a fiction. Families rarely notice the tension between surface and depth. They prefer the comfort of the headline. During brunch, my grandmother asked Evan if he could help move a table, and he complied with such effortless warmth that my mother beamed at me from across the room. It was the kind of silent approval I'd wanted for years, and yet it didn't feel like mine. Archetypes have a way of lending you borrowed dignity. You bask in it, but you know it isn't earned. If you've ever been congratulated for something you didn't actually achieve, you understand the odd mix of pride and guilt. After the meal, I finally confronted Tessa. "This isn't sustainable," I told her. She looked unbothered. "Who cares? It bought you peace. It impressed Pete. Isn't that the point?" Her perspective was pragmatic, almost cynical. In her world, optics were strategy, and strategy was survival. I envied her certainty, but I couldn't share it. For me, the cost of pretending felt heavier than the questions it had silenced. Evan, to his credit, kept his professional distance. He never overstepped, never hinted at anything beyond the agreed script. That detachment made him oddly trustworthy. As we said our goodbyes, he shook my hand firmly in the foyer, a quiet signal that the job was complete. My family interpreted it as affection, not contract. That was the paradox. His professionalism only deepened their belief in our story. Driving away, I replayed the weekend like a film reel. The laughter, the relief, the advice from Pete, all of it had been filtered through a role I hadn't chosen. I had gained what I wanted: my uncle's backing, my family's approval, a brief reprieve from scrutiny. But I couldn't decide whether I'd won something real or just accepted a flattering illusion. That question stayed with me longer than the holiday itself. Back in Columbus, the quiet of my apartment felt sharper than usual. No layers of chatter, no overlapping conversations, just silence and my own reflection. Families define you through repetition. Once you're out of their orbit, you hear your own voice again, and sometimes it sounds unfamiliar. I replayed Evan's line on the porch. "People want patterns. I give them one they recognize." It explained more than just my Christmas. It explained why approval had felt so conditional all my life. At work the following week, Pete's recommendations translated into tangible progress. The grant committee scheduled a meeting, and my proposal gained traction. Professionally, the charade had paid off. But every congratulatory email carried a reminder. I'd leaned on borrowed credibility. If you've ever advanced because of something you didn't fully own, you know the taste, sweet at first, then hollow. I thought about Evan, his calm detachment, how he moved through roles without letting them stick. Maybe that was the real skill, performing without internalizing. I envied it, but I wasn't built that way. I couldn't pretend the illusion hadn't mattered. My family's acceptance, my uncle's faith, it all rested on an outline of me that wasn't real. Archetypes made things easier for them, but they left me wrestling with the gap between perception and truth. As January settled in, I made a decision. Next time I faced my family, I wouldn't bring a placeholder. Not because the experiment had failed, it had worked too well, but because I wanted to test whether I could hold my ground without props. Approval earned through fiction is still approval, but it doesn't last. Quiet respect, even if slower to arrive, is sturdier. When I think back on that Christmas now, I don't regret it. Evan played his part, Tessa proved her theory, and I learned something I couldn't have grasped otherwise. Peace bought by pretending is never permanent. Archetypes can shield you for a season, but eventually, you have to decide whether you're willing to live inside the role or step back into the mess of being yourself. And that, I realized, was the only story I actually wanted to keep telling.